What is the documentary hypothesis? Who was Julius Wellhausen, and what motivated him to come up with this theory of the Old Testament? What ramifications has the documentary hypothesis had for the history of Christian theology and biblical scholarship? On this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center, we're going to address this issue with our special guest, Old Testament professor, Dr. Michael Thigpen of Phoenix Seminary. My name's Anthony Costello. I'm the president of the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics. Let me get that out. At the Kirkwood Center is where we bring the best of Christian scholarship to the local church to equip the saints for engaging with the culture. So Mike, welcome again to the podcast. Before we get started on this topic of the documentary hypothesis, as regards to the Old Testament, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're at, and what you're doing?
I'm professor of Old Testament at Phoenix Seminary, so I teach the languages, I teach Old Testament book studies, and I've been doing Old Testament work for north of 30 years now.
Okay. And Phoenix Seminary, that's in Phoenix, I guess,
yes,
right?
Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay. All right, there you go, everybody. If you want to go check out the website and maybe sign up for some classes. Mike, so we've done a couple sessions on the Old Testament now. We wanted to turn to, this is not an issue necessarily of Old Testament theology, but it certainly has ramifications for maybe how we do Old Testament theology. But I think this will be a term that's at least maybe vaguely familiar to some of our audience, the documentary hypothesis, which has to do with the sources of the Old Testament books. So maybe give us the introductory sort of sermon here on what is the documentary hypothesis, who started it, when did it come into existence, and what was some of the background around this?
Sure. So in its most recognizable form, it really begins in the late 1800s with a scholar named Julius Wellhausen. Now, Wellhausen is not the originator of the idea. There are several generations prior to him where people postulated essentially what it's known for, four sources. One, a Yahwistic source, one that would use the name Old King James Version Jehovah, so that's the J of the JEDP theory, or Yahweh as we would think about it in the Hebrew. One, Elohim, so sources that use the generic name God, but not the proper or covenant name Yahweh or Jehovah. And then the priestly source and the Deuteronomic source. And so these ideas had been out there for a while. You could go as far back as Benedict Spinoza to think about someone who was advocating that Moses was not actually the author of the Pentateuch, but would see it as later or those kinds of things. And so the source theory comes around, and really what Wellhausen does that popularizes it is he kind of stops messing around and says, look, he heard from another scholar, a guy named Graff. So sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the Graff-Wellhausen hypothesis. Okay. What he heard was that the prophets preceded the law. And it's a period of German Romanticism in this stretch. So there's a love for things that are oral, not written, a love for things that are poetic and lively and life-giving, not codified, not written. Those are dead and sterile. So you can see why they would think the prophets come first. And what Wellhausen really did was he said, I'm not going to look at the Old Testament. What I'm going to do is take my theory of how the religion of Israel grew from this more lively, oral, short, prophetic through to the codified law, the written, and then I'm going to assign the text based on that. And so he really works from a theory of how the religion of Israel evolved to a theory of how the text came to be. So he's purely saying, I'm going to look at this. And so over time, various kind of features or criteria come to play that they'll use to say where there's a split in the text. But so what they're asserting is A, Moses is not the author of the Pentateuch. B, the Pentateuch was written over vast stretches of time, slowly edited together. And in this earliest form, they would say it really was out of four primary documents. One that was oriented around people who worshiped by this name, Yahweh or Jehovah in the old translation, by those who used generically the term God, by those who were oriented around the priestly law, and then those who are oriented around this stream of Deuteronomy and its sort of retelling of the history of Israel. That's kind of the 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I mean, so we would mid 1800s is when Wellhausen is working. But as you said, there's already a lot of speculation in this direction.
Mhm.
I remember reading one of the, history of philosophy books about Spinoza, kind of almost as being maybe the first or one of the earlier figures, Enlightenment figures, to kind of sort of raise the question of Mosaic authorship. And some people might even see him as sort of the father of modern biblical criticism, I guess. But then there's this sort of, German idealism, romanticism, sort of philosophy that is in the air at the time a lot of these guys are working. And you said they're sort of developing a theory of how these ancient cultures must have been, that maybe is influencing. So then creates a model, and then there's sort of like, how can we apply the model to the text? So you feel there's a sense there of the theory sort of overwhelming the data, the actual data.
Yeah, I think so. So to be
Front.
fair to them, I
Yeah.
think what they would assert, and what many would today that still hold to this, is it's what we call a heuristic. It may not get us
Cool.
to the right answer, but it's a helpful way of thinking,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
So if we're looking at it from this perspective, it's a helpful way. So they would then see that it explains features that they do see in the text. So they would look at things like, well, why are different names for God used?
Yeah.
There
Okay.
must be an explanation for that. Why are some stories told more than once, or why are stories told repetitively? Maybe that means that there was more than one version running around. They're going to look at things, places where they have a sense that there's a contradiction. So maybe these are from two different sources that were wedded together. Things like that they would say are literary evidences of these things. Changes in style, literary style, say within the Pentateuch, that they would assert then makes it look like it's not written by a single author because it doesn't all sound and read the same.
Right.
So
Right.
they
Right.
are looking at literary evidences, but then their means of saying, what do I do with these things I have questions about? Well, here's a theory that they say is helpful. So I'll just plug all that data into this theory, and then here's where it goes. And
Yeah.
so they do start with a theory, but they are working with real
Which
pieces of
that's
evidence.
yeah. I mean, and that is the burden of, well, not just every scholar, but of every man, to have to work with some kind of mental model, theory, and then look at the data and see what explains best the data in front of us. So yeah, we don't want to ascribe any malintention. Actually, I was reading in just recently in a book by Peter Berger, the sociologist of religion, where he just mentions Wellhausen, on one or two pages about Wellhausen, and he kind of talks about how this was a real struggle for Wellhausen. Like, we probably don't want to, you know, um, like, interpret these guys as just like malevolent actors or something. That apparently for Wellhausen, as he had the model and he's applying it because he probably thinks this is the best of sort of like analytical tools of the day, and he's in the culture of his time as well, and that's going to influence his own thinking. But that this actually was a struggle for him, and he considered retiring from his professorship of Old Testament and so on and so forth. So that
Yeah,
as he
many
was
of
just,
them stepped out of the pastorate as they moved
yeah,
because they felt like they couldn't teach anymore. And some of
right,
the earlier ones actually lost their professorates because they were so far outside the mainstream at that point.
yeah,
And now it becomes mainstream down the road. But many of them really wrestled with this at a personal level because it has implications for how they understand the scriptures and what they
yeah,
think about
yeah,
God. And so it was oftentimes, I mean, this is I think even Spinoza is there. He's wrestling with what it means to be Jewish, and what the sort of the faith is, and how you should understand truth. So these are oftentimes deeply personal kinds of things that come in. And so while I would kind of vigorously disagree with them on how they read the text, I think
Yeah.
many of them were going through some fairly personal kinds of angst over
Yeah.
what to do with all of this.
So let's talk about that. So he comes. I mean, he formalizes, I guess we'd say, what has been brewing in biblical scholarship up to his time, with the four different sources. Right? Maybe speak to each of the sources a little bit more specifically, precisely, if you can.
Yeah, so the first two, J and E, are
Yeah.
generally divided based on whether or not the name of God, the covenant name disclosed, say in Exodus 3, and then again Exodus 6, Yahweh or Jehovah in the Old King James, is used. And sort of sees that one as being primarily focused on the covenant relationships with Israel. And the second source, E, Elohim, is one that's the generic Hebrew term for
Yeah.
God. It can be used both of Israel's God as well as other gods of the nations. Same term. It's just like us. We would, capital G, lowercase g. It's the same word, but we can either mean it of God or of what anyone might call a god or a deity. And then the priestly source would be all the sort of legislative material that you get around the priesthood. A lot of that priestly material is both, it's clear because it is priestly in orientation, but there also is a sense, right? You're beginning to get moves in history of, well, history's written by the winners. So who's the last authority standing in the line of Israel? Well, it's the priesthood. So that means it must
Mm.
be the latest source if you get
Okay.
there.
I see.
So that's why I have JEDP. And then D really is Deuteronomy. So beginning with Deuteronomy, running all the way through Kings, or some would say Jeremiah, is you're trying to explain, how did we end up in exile? Well, covenant was given, covenant was broken. Here are the consequences. This is explanatory for how we get there. So you're really sort of thinking about it in those ways. Now, what's interesting is Wellhausen himself didn't answer many nitty gritty questions. So one of the challenges is someone will say, oh, well, this is an e-source. It's Elohim, it's generic God, but that text will have Yahweh in it. So what you do is you just go, well, that must be a later edition. So we'll just boot that out. Now, you don't have a text. You can't find an ancient manuscript that doesn't have Yahweh in it, but you just assume that it wasn't there. Yeah, Wellhausen didn't get into any of that. He wanted to keep the simplicity of the overall system and not get bogged down in the details where we might disagree about these things. And that's part of what gave his version of it lasting power, because he really focused up here at the grand scheme of how the religion evolved in his mind. And it really is an evolutionary model from more simple to more complex, right? So if you think about it, prophetic, somebody shows up and just utters a word, that's pretty simple. Complexity would be kingship, temple, all the rituals. So if I'm thinking in an evolutionary perspective, I have to start simple and small and move to grand and complex. I have to order it that way if I'm going to be kind of in an evolutionary mindset, which is, this is all happening at the same time. And so those two kinds of ideas overlap. And then you also, like with evolution, physically, you need stretches of time for
Mhm.
these changes to take place and to move from one to the other.
I mean, just to sharpen that point a little bit. I mean, I think it's always it is important for us to realize that evolutionary thing. Now, there's evolutionary thought in this, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks as well. You know that, I mean, there's certain pre-Socratic philosophers that had similar understandings of the natural world that Darwin would later, posit as a theory of biological life, but that, you have because you have Hegel, right, in the historical evolution, and then of course Darwin, and everybody is in the scholarly world at that time in Europe is really working. Not everybody, but presupposing this simple to complex evolution of everything. It always sort of has to happen that way, and I think we at least got to take that into consideration. That is sort of the intellectual milieu of the day, a presupposition that a lot of people are working with, and that might have we might not need to buy into that wholesale necessarily, right? Yeah. Okay. So, but Wellhausen wants to keep it fairly rudimentary, simple, four sources, big picture. simple to complex evolutionary. But okay, so what are like what are some of the more immediate ramifications of this then for the church at the time? What starts to
Sure.
fall out because of this new model?
Um, so, I mean, what you get is a basic kind of a dichotomy here, which is a pretty much Enlightenment model where our theory trumps the story of the text, right? So, what the text gives us of how this developed, the text says Moses gives legislation in this period for the priesthood. The theory says that isn't until way late.
Yeah.
So, you really sort of move to see the text as a fictionalized text. It's a story, but it's not historically accurate. Our reconstruction is historically accurate, but it begins to fragment
Mhm.
because one of the critiques of the model is no one divvies up the sources in the same ways. No, right? You can't run the system and then everybody comes up with the same answer and go, okay, we must be right because we're all coming to the same conclusions. In fact, it's been horribly fragmented and people disagree and they get into the minutia. Well, this half verse is this half verse is that. The old joke was, that some scholars would know that this, redactor was left-handed and spoke with a lisp. I mean, right? Things you can't
Right.
obviously
Yeah.
tell from the text, but they just kind of seem to have this insight. So it's not produced consistent results. But what happens is people then use the theory and it looks consistent because I'm living within the constraints of the theory. I'm not
Mhm.
going to test the theory. I'm just going to use the theory and then churn new results. I had one senior scholar who I won't name who said, look, he was not a Christian, um, faithful in his own way, but was not really into the documentary hypothesis approach. He believed there were sources, but you couldn't sort them out. And he
Right.
said, "Look, one of the wonderful things this gives you is about every 10 years you can declare yourself wrong, issue a new book on how the sources fit together, and rejuvenate your career."
But
And
all
so that
staying within the same basic framework of the hypothesis, right?
because at the end of
Yeah.
the day, there are no texts that exist
Right.
that
Okay.
show the Old Testament in this arrangement in any way. What we have is the text we have.
Yeah.
So everything is only theoretical. And so I can spin the theory in any direction that I want. That's part of the problem. There's no external validation for this because there are no manuscripts that exist that give it to us in the source.
Right. So
And
yeah, there's no manuscripts that from the time or close to the time that exist that would give us the source. This right, and then there's also no source uh, speaking about this process at all.
correct.
Like I so and so received these manuscripts from my
Yeah.
predecessor rabbi, or that they wouldn't have been called rabbi way back then, but from this preceding scribe, and so there's no text like that as well that would in any way give us a evidence or hint that there was this process.
Right. The oldest text that we have look basically like the text that we have in our Old Testament today. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are
Yeah.
the oldest sort of copies that we have of individual pieces and parts of the scripture, and they look like what we have. So, um, yeah, there's no external evidence. It's all internal. The way I read the style of the story, the way I read the duplications or repetition, it's the way I read it, and then I'm going to give you my theory. And that's why still today it really is, it's the hypothesis because it cannot be proven because there's no manuscript evidence for it. It is my telling of how I think it came together,
Yeah.
but it is a telling that is absent external data.
So what are some of the internal evidences that led Wellhausen and others and to, I mean, you mentioned duplications, for example.
Sure.
So what are some, maybe give us three or
Yeah.
four of the things that would be sort of empirical evidence? There they are in the text to say like, oh, this is hard to explain. Let's maybe
Right.
hunt to the model as an
Yeah, and,
explanation.
and I'm going to speak broadly about
Yeah.
where it is. I'm not a historical scholar in that, in
No,
that,
I
like knowing
understand.
exactly
Yeah.
what Wellhausen is. We'll speak
Yeah.
generically. First one is the names of God. So
Mm.
explaining why, for instance, Genesis 1, you get Elohim, you get generically God. Genesis 2, you get Yahweh Elohim with that covenant name. So you go long stretches using just God. You have other stretches that have Yahweh. So how do we explain that? That would be one that's used. Variations of style and language. So, right, we get the sort of the language of, say, the genealogies. It's very different than how we tell other stories. So it just feels a little different. We shift in and
Yeah.
out of these things. So there are things like that that play in. We get some really tight portions of scripture, like the Joseph story kind of reads like a little novella,
Mhm.
kind of tightly wound in its own way. So what does that look like incorporated into the rest of Genesis? Um, some people would say they're contradictions. So the account of the creation of the world in Genesis 1 as opposed to Genesis 2.
Yeah.
So things like, well, did we create Adam and Eve at the same time? Did we create man and then later Eve? Those kinds of questions. What about the plants and animals and when were they created relative to humanity in Genesis 1 and 2? Some things like that. Those would be the kinds of things that people would look at and go, I think I should sort this out. You could get others like, so Abraham gives Sarah away more than once to a foreign power by claiming that she is his sister, not his wife. Isaac
Yeah.
does the same thing. So there we've
Or
got
they look
three
kind of like,
repetitions.
yeah, repetitions that look like, what would you call it? Like archetypal stories or something like
Archetypal, are they
that.
stock stories? So why do they occur
Yeah.
more than once? And I might make the assumption as a scholar that that means that they're not true. They didn't actually happen. We're
Yeah.
reusing the material,
Right.
is
Right.
one of the ways that that's considered.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I mean, but people would say like, yeah, I mean, there are things there that that Wellhausen's model is trying to make sense of, right? And
Yeah.
then the variations on the model since he first formalized it or put it together. Um, so okay, so where this is probably kind of the big question for this episode then is where is the documentary hypothesis right now? Like I know it's always hard to ask like what does the consensus of scholars say, but like where I mean it's geez almost 200 years roughly
Yeah.
since he probably first sort of that scholars have been working with this framework. What's its current status in that sense?
Consensus is fragmented. Even amongst those who follow the documentary hypothesis, it's fragmented. So I'll sort of say maybe there are four camps that you would get into.
Okay.
You have some who are really continuing the same kind of work, not that different from Wellhausen and those who followed. This might be someone like Jeffrey Stackert in his book, A Prophet Like Moses, who really is asking religious studies questions of the text, using his understanding of how religions develop to continue to say, then this is the order of how the text would have been written based on an outside understanding of how religions develop generally. That would be one.
Okay. Okay.
You get others like Joel Baden in his book, Composition of the Pentateuch, renewing the documentary hypothesis. He trashes everything. Names of God is not a valid source. Variations of style and language is not valid. The only criteria he would use is narrative inconsistency. So when we get a
Okay.
break in the story that I can't resolve, then I have different sources. So it has much larger chunks of text. Still has
Okay.
pretty much the same range of text. Although even today, a lot of scholars would join J and E and say we know that they existed, but now they always look like they're joined at the hip, so we can't really
Yeah.
tease them
Yeah.
apart.
I've seen that in the commentaries that I've read. Some of the commentaries I've read, J and E are almost like always
Yeah.
mentioned together. In that, yeah.
And then you have a lot of scholars who would fit in the realm of, okay, I think it's probably sources. I think it's unlikely that a historical figure named Moses wrote all this, but I think the enterprise of trying to sort those sources out is absolutely foolish. You can't do it. So there was one scholar who took one of the Dead Sea Scrolls documents that is a mixture and kind of a rehash of scripture and said, okay, if this is good, we should be able to predict what these quotations, joins, all this will look like. And in fact, the predictions fail every time. And we know the source material because they were using the Old Testament, and we know this document because we see it. And he could not replicate, even going forward, sort of this. So he tried to validate it that way. So a lot of scholars would say, in theory, yes. I think there are sources, but you cannot sort them out, so it's not a
Okay.
useful enterprise. That has led to a resurgence of people who focus on the unity of the Pentateuch or of the Old Testament as a whole, thinking about it in terms of its final literary quality. Now, the beauty of that is it allows, like evangelical scholars and those who are more secular in their approach, to have good conversations. Like, okay, we're going to disagree about how we got the text that we have. Let's talk about the text as it exists as a piece of literature.
Hmm.
Let's talk about this book or the Pentateuch as a whole, the movements through it, the themes, and we can disagree over its origin story, but we can
Okay.
talk about it as it stands. That's a more productive conversation. And then you would have those who are like who would, documentary hypothesis is dead. That's not really true, but it lacks its consensus power in terms of JEDP, the particular dating, how they come together. The neatness of it is largely gone. There's a strand that would still follow that. Many would have a different conception, far more complex maybe. And some would say, generally I agree, but I'm not going to get into the weeds because I don't think we can sort it out. And then you have those who are like, this is fruitless because it doesn't help us with the text as it stands. Those you're going to have both evangelicals in there as well as some non-evangelicals who are going to talk more about the final literary form of the text because that's a more fruitful conversation per se.
Okay, so just to summarize, so you have those who are still trying to basically just work within the tradition of the documentary hypothesis, and they're continue to speculate further and further, or more fine grained on the tradition, those sources, the posited
Mm-hmm.
sources. You have the one scholar and people like him who are saying only posit separate sources when we see something like inconsistencies or contradictions, but not for maybe these other criteria like name of God. Those are all invalid criteria. We don't need to posit separate sources for use different names of God or even duplications of stories that seem similar or anything like that. Then you have maybe what we call like the final form crowd, right? Where we're having these productive, here's the final form of the text. Let's discuss the content, right? Let's discuss the themes, what it's saying, so on and so forth. And then the fourth would be just sort of like the documentary hypothesis is dead. It's totally irrelevant at this point, and we can't use it at all.
Yeah, which is overstated. What that
Yeah,
usually means
right.
is it's dead to me.
Dead to me. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
And it's challenging because, so I'll step out here, not on a limb, but maybe say something that is not always thought of. The Pentateuch is composed of sources in that,
Yeah.
okay, so I think Moses wrote it, but Moses is not around for the creation account, right? He's not there.
Probably not,
So
unless he's a
yeah,
very, very unique individual.
yeah, not there, right? So
Yeah,
the question is, how does he receive that? Well, he
right.
could have just had God could have disclosed it to him,
Yeah,
but he could have had oral or written sources,
right.
stories of the creation that God propagated through time, which he takes, and then through the process of inspiration, he ensures that they're told the way God wants them to be.
Right.
The genealogies are things that have always been kept. People keep genealogies. So I don't think Moses is creating these or writing them afresh, but what does he choose? How much does he disclose? But those are there. We get things like Numbers 21 mentions a bit of text that's getting ready to get quoted that comes from a document called the Book of the Wars of the Lord, or the Book of the Wars of Yahweh. So the text itself acknowledges that other works exist that are not scripture. So here's a little poetic fragment that comes from this other book that talks about the wars that Yahweh has fought on behalf of his people that gets incorporated here. So the idea that there are differences in style in a Pentateuch make perfect sense because Moses is incorporating material that well precedes him, right? So all of Genesis precedes his lifetime. And he's incorporating many old pieces of that, whether they're oral, whether they're freshly given to him by God, or whether they're from existing written documents. All these things are being melded together by Moses as an author. So the idea that it feels fragmented in that way is exactly right. It's like when I read, sometimes when you have a student, when I taught undergrad, I would occasionally see evidence of plagiarism. And usually I knew it because students writing along at a very basic level, and all of a sudden something comes across that's very erudite and
Yeah.
informed
Okay.
and does not read
Yeah.
like the rest of their paper. And I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure this came from a scholar and you didn't cite it. Well, in the ancient Near East, they don't cite. They
Yeah.
don't
Are you
give us
saying
like the
Moses plagiarized? Moses plagiarized? He would have got expelled from
different
class.
expectations in the
Yeah.
same way that
No.
we always attribute authorship.
Yeah, that's
It's
right.
very rare in the ancient Near East to say this story by this person. What's usually
Right.
listed is who the scribe was that faithfully copied it. That's more
Hmm.
common. So the idea that there are sources involved, I think, is absolutely true,
Yeah. Right.
including things like some post-Mosaic things. I
Yeah.
doubt that Moses wrote the account of his death. I doubt that Moses wrote that he was the most humble man ever. These are probably things that Joshua or someone like that included in finalizing and finishing up. We get little editorial things of, this place we call Dan, it used to have this name,
Yeah.
but
Right.
now
The
we call it
updating of
that.
names. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have some things like that are clearly editorial, some
Right.
statements like to this day, so you can make the connection. So we have some things like that. So the idea that there are sources is, I think, on its face, absolutely true.
Obvious.
The
Yeah.
idea that we have this evolutionary approach that the history is completely out of whack is purely a hypothesis without anything more than, well, do you like the hypothesis? If so, then you take it. If not, then you don't.
Yeah.
There's no external proof for it in the way that it comes along.
Yeah. So maybe like it'd be better to describe Moses as author and editor of the Pentateuch, and not just author, but he's pulling things together um, as things are revealed to him, and from other sources as well. I don't that I just made the comment that we could see Moses as author and editor of the Pentateuch.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think most biblical authors serve as both author and editor because even like you take the prophets, um, they don't always arrange, just like the gospel writers, they don't always arrange their material chronologically. So they're just not
Right.
keeping a
Right.
journal of their prophecies.
Yeah.
They are then taking them and reusing them in the context of the book to give a larger and more holistic message than any individual prophecy. So they are editing those pieces together as they bring them into a book, or maybe someone like Baruch is editing Jeremiah's together. So yes, Moses is doing a lot of editorial work because God's saying, record this, record that. And then he's weaving those things together. A travelogue here, keep track of where you went. This law is given. And then he's telling these stories and bringing them all together. So it's a massively edited work. And sometimes you can see the evidence of that editorial work that's taking place. That's a far different thing from then the assertion that the prophets precede the law simply because that's how we think religion develops. That's a totally different, that's not literarily based. That's based on my understanding of religion. And then I apply that to the literature. And that's really
Right.
what Wellhausen brought to the table.
Or the multiplication, just the multiplication of sources every time we see something that doesn't quite fit into a more contemporary way of writing history, or because uh as you say, like you have ancient authors stitching material together. And I do think that one of the things that is just always very difficult for modern readers is that things aren't in necessarily in chronological order, and we like everything in our linear chronological order. That's how we tend to think and read now, but
Yes.
that wasn't necessarily the case in the past, right?
Yeah, and the other literatures outside of ancient Israel, they use duplication and repetition. Sometimes whole things get repeated in certain parts of the story. It's kind of a framing device. So
Yeah.
all these pieces. So there is a scholar, Joshua Berman, who's not an evangelical, but he pushes really hard against the documentary hypothesis. And one of it is based on the way that ancient Near Eastern stories work. And many of the things that are claimed by source critics to be evidence of multiple sources are simply how literature was done in the ancient Near East.
Was done at
And
the
and
time. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and he's illustrated that in a few of his works, and
What
which I think is very helpful.
I mean, say that name again. Then what would be a good book if people wanted to pursue this a little bit more for theology, Bible studies, apologetics reasons? Like, what would be a good book that you might, or a good author or two that you might recommend on maybe the history of the documentary hypothesis and again its current status and like
Sure. So I'm going to give you a few here.
yeah,
Old work, 1940s, a Jewish scholar by the name of Umberto Cassuto.
Kasuda. Yeah.
Cassuto wrote a book called The Documentary Hypothesis. And he went through the 5 criteria: names, repetition, changes in style, and just kind of obliterates them at a literary level. And so his critique is why people like Baden say we're only going to deal with narrative inconsistency. So he would be an old source, very easy. These were public lectures, so there is a little bit of Hebrew in them, but they're relatively straightforward to get to. At a little more ambitious level, in terms of history, Mark Genelette, a prophet Beeson Divinity School, has a brief history of Old Testament criticism. He's going to start with Spinoza and work through 8 major figures, setting them in their historical context, what's going on around them, both scholars who precede them, as well as kind of the soup they're swimming in culturally, philosophically. I think he's the best survey of that to look
That
at.
one
So he's
sounds. I
going
might
to
have to pick that one up myself. What was his name again?
Genelette,
Genelette.
Ginilliat,
Okay.
Genelette from Beeson, A Brief History of Old Testament Criticism. So I think that's very good. If you
Excellent.
want to read sort of a contemporary critique of it, Joshua Berman is the scholar that I mentioned, not an evangelical, but I find his work helpful. Um, he has Inconsistency in the Torah. And that is his book where he's looking at ancient literary conventions and how they don't really support the way that the documentary hypothesis has sort of carved things up. Their literary hallmarks don't really hold true. Now, there are a lot of things I would disagree with what Berman has done, and we would not read similarly, but I think he's helpful on comparing and contrasting the way the scriptures work, the way ancient Near Eastern text works. I think he does some helpful things there.
That's good. That's good. I would definitely want to look. I might certainly want to look into one of the two of those myself. I mean, let me ask. Let me just end. Maybe we'll wrap up with maybe this kind of question. Um, maybe we can't prove, right? We got to proof is one of those loaded words, but prove Mosaic authorship. But do we have any reasons really to doubt Mosaic authorship? I mean, if are there any good reasons to actually doubt that?
I don't think so. I think we
Yeah.
have to be cautious in that we do have, I think, pretty clearly some later editorial updatings
Hmm.
of things. We do have some additions, I think, like his death scene and some other things. So I think we have to be cautious in that. And I don't assume, and this is an assumption, but I don't assume that he was the original penner of every word. If he did incorporate some existing sources like the genealogies, so not that he de novo, right? So he may be using sources. So with all those caveats in mind, we consistently push back the date of writing in alphabetic script in the ancient Near East. Every few years, we discover something new that pushes it back. And we are now getting into the Mosaic era with not only writing, but with the presence of schools, places where you can see like military officers being trained in writing for dispatches and things back and forth in a way that sort of the old criticism that they weren't literate enough really doesn't hold water
Right. So
anymore.
in Wellhausen's day, he might not have had access to that kind of archaeological and historical data that we now have.
There's a mantra that people should know: the absence of evidence is not
Not the
evidence of absence,
evidence.
right?
Correct.
So there's
Right.
a fundamental logical flaw there that says because we don't have it, it doesn't exist. And in fact,
Yeah.
it keeps showing up over and over again. So Moses would have been trained in Pharaoh's household. So you have him being educated on his own. We have, an increasing age for both the evidence of alphabetic script, as well as the presence of training of scribes in the ancient Near East. Now, we're not fully back there. We don't have, Moses' school book. But all those things continue to make it more and more plausible. And in the rest of the ancient Near East, in what we call the cuneiform world, the places where people were writing in the wedge-shaped scripts like Ugaritic and like Akkadian for the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and before them the Sumerians, this stuff is old. This stuff is, 3000 BC, 2500 BC. Even on the most conservative dating of Moses, you're talking about literature being produced 1,000 years before he's around. And so, although that's not being done in alphabetic script, to presume then that it could not have happened simply just asserts evidence that we don't have. So no, I don't think we have any good reason to doubt Mosaic authorship as it's presented in the text. He is compiling sources. He is editing. There are some later edits and things made to the text as it's transmitted on, and those sorts of things. But no, I don't think we have any good reason to say this is not, most people use the term essentially Mosaic.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. I mean, it's kind of reassuring, I think, to me at least. So, and I wrote a chapter a few years ago for an apologetics book it was more on Old Testament manuscripts and textual criticism. But yeah, that's kind of where it seemed like a lot of the scholarship was now, like, we don't necessarily have to get rid of Moses here,
Right.
with regards to authorship and editing of the Pentateuch. Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, Michael, this has been very illuminating. I've really appreciated having this discussion with you, and look forward to maybe having you on again for more Old Testament stuff. Wish you the best. And yeah, thanks again for being on the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.